Hamas should be treated exactly the way ISIS was treated. They should be spit out from the community of nations. No leader should meet them. No country should harbor them. And those that do should be sanctioned.
As Israel's defense needs evolve, we will work with Congress to make sure that they're met. And I can tell you, there is overwhelming bipartisan support in our Congress for Israel's security.
U.S. Secretary of State there, Antony Blinken, in Israel, alongside Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the sixth day of war in the Middle East. The U.S. vowing support, as you heard, and the U.K. today announcing it will send surveillance aircraft and 2 Navy ships to the eastern Mediterranean. Meanwhile, on the Canadian side, the first 2 evacuation flights took off from Tel Aviv and landed in Athens this afternoon. More military flights are expected over the coming days. The government, though, still has no options to get Canadians trapped in Gaza out. Joining us to better understand what is happening on the front lines of this war, we have a special edition of The Front Bench. President of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, David Perry, is here. Janice Stein with the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy is as well. And Marissa Kerma is the Middle East Program Director at the Wilson Center. Hi, everybody. Really good to see you tonight. I appreciate you making the time. Mr. Perry, I'll start with you. How likely do you think a ground offensive into Gaza is at this point?
I think that's a pretty significant likelihood. Trying to degrade the Hamas's military capacity, which has been demonstrated to be very extensive, even just in terms of the direct support to that horrific, barbaric, and very broadly spread, highly coordinated activity, I think is going to take a lot more than airstrikes, or at least a very sustained period of airstrikes. So I think that's a very significant risk at this point.
Professor Stein, I wanted to ask you your thoughts as well on the likelihood of something like that happening before we get into the impact of it as well.
You know, Vassy, it's really interesting because your earlier guest was saying it's almost as if Hamas created the conditions that made it almost impossible domestically because of the outrage and grief in the country for Israel not to engage in a ground offensive. Well, then, when that's what your adversary wants you to do, you might want to think twice about doing it. This is, in fact, not a good option. There will be huge casualties in the ground offensive, primarily of Palestinian civilians, but also of IDF forces. The results are unclear. You destroy rocket-making equipment, but that is a domestic industry. It gets stood up again. Hamas leaders are either already out of the country or in the tunnels. There is now.
I'm so sorry to cut you off, Professor Stein. We're having a lot of difficulty hearing you. I'm so sorry. It's a very hollow sound. So I just want to make sure our audience. I'll get our control room to try and fix it because I know what you're saying is very valuable, and I want to make sure our audience hears it. Ms. Kerma, I'll move on to you and sort of bridge the gap with what we were just talking about and get your thoughts on the risk of a ground offensive and the likelihood of it happening.
Well, I agree with my colleague earlier that it is a possibility. I mean, more than 300,000 reservists have been called in, and there are preparations on the ground. It is a possibility. Of course, there is a danger for escalation across the region, which is very much directly linked to whether troops will enter Gaza or not. But the response will be unprecedented from the Israeli side, as military strategists and generals and the Israeli Prime Minister declared throughout the week, precisely because Hamas has gone all in. This was an unprecedented attack, a horrific attack, and a multi-pronged attack. And of course, there are dangers and high stakes for escalation, particularly on the northern border. The likelihood of that happening is also very high if a ground invasion happens.
Can we talk for a second, Mr. Perry, about the possibility of the northern border and basically what the possibility of more of an additional front there might mean? At this point, I mean, the Israeli army is saying there have been some infractions, there have been some rockets fired over. Yesterday there were sirens. They said it was basically a false alarm. There weren't drones. But it seems like it's very intense along that border as well. How much will that, if something were to happen there, how much will that intensify what already is happening?
It would be hugely impactful. I mean, if you look at even just the potential for different air threats, so the rockets, the mortars, the drones, if Israel had to position its air defenses, which are very capable but are relatively limited in quantity to defend both against the demonstrated ability that Hamas has, as well as point them in a northern region, they only have so many of those assets. So even in that threat of having to potentially distribute and water down its defenses to deal with two different potential vectors would be highly consequential. And beyond that, obviously, with the history there, including for Canada, we lost a member of our armed forces there not all that long ago. So there's a recent history of some of those even more low-grade types of activities having consequential impacts, including the loss of human life.
Professor Stein, I think we've reconnected to you, so I hope that I hope you can hear me okay, and I'm even more hopeful that we can hear you okay. We're just talking about the possibility of another front to the war and it potentially spilling out into other parts of the region. How concerned are you about that possibility right now?
Well, I'm less concerned about that than I am about a ground war, frankly, but there's certainly a possibility. But that's where the United States has invested most of its effort and its assets. It has been very active diplomatically, sending messages through every conceivable channel, indirectly both to Iran and to Hezbollah, urging restraint. Turkey has been involved, Qatar has been involved. There is really a very concerted effort, and that's why you're seeing actually very, very muted activity on the Northern Front. They're almost performative probes. Now, can they escalate? Can things get out of hand? Very, very easily in this part of the world. But so far, that has not happened.
Yeah, I think it's a salient point, Ms. Kerma. I see you nodding your head because there has been some activity, and certainly yesterday it was more intensified, but it certainly isn't anywhere near what it could be. And I actually was speaking to an IDF spokesperson on our program last night, and he essentially conveyed that they were taking a bit of comfort in that.
Yeah, I think there's domestic politics everywhere right now, Vassy. There's incredible grief and rage inside Israel that crosses the political spectrum. This was such a radicalizing attack, frankly, by the nature of how it was executed and who was killed, women and children. In the West Bank, there's, of course, overwhelming support for Palestinians in Lebanon, which is filled with Palestinians in the southern part, as well as Hezbollah, their support. So these are all tinderboxes that are ready to go off, but there is nevertheless restraint. There's a recognition by the Hezbollah leadership that the consequences of an attack are terrible for the infrastructure of southern Lebanon. They've been there and done that one.
Ms. Kerma, do you agree with the assessment that Hezbollah would be aware of that at this point and is exercising some restraint? I again sort of couch that by saying at this point.
They are exercising some restraint at this point and sort of sticking to the rules of engagement of the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel. But of course, regional leaders are at it, calling each other. Secretary Blinken will be visiting multiple countries in the region, Qatar, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and others, in order to ensure that this does not go out of hand. And as you mentioned in your reporting earlier, the United States is also taking all the steps necessary by sending USS carriers. Gerald Ford is a few days away, and then in the next 2 weeks, another one is also on its way. Those are meant to deter non-state and state actors that President Biden mentioned in his speech. And of course, he meant Hezbollah and Hezbollah supporters in Iran.
And it's very
Speaking
interesting.
of Iran, sorry, 1 second, Professor Stein. I just want to get Mr. Perry in, and then I'll conclude with one last question to you. Just on the point, Mr. Perry, about Iran specifically, I noticed the list of countries that Secretary Blinken is headed to does not include Iran. We know today that the $6 billion that was supposed to be unfrozen in exchange for the prisoners that Iran released is now, according to some agreement with Qatar and some reporting that's come out from multiple U.S. media outlets, being held, basically not being released. What does that tell you?
I think it's an indication Iran supported this, at least generally, and there's an active effort to determine how specifically. But the fact that they very much underwrite the whole activity of the organization, and again, to reinforce that this was a really complicated, quite large activity that demonstrated a complete and catastrophic breakdown of Israel's existing security arrangements. To have this consequential number of losses of life, number of wounded, this many different points of attack, the level of coordination, all points to not just an intelligence and a security failure, but one that I think if you were an Israeli national security official right now, you'd be revalidating all of your assumptions about the status quo security architecture and circumstances in place, not just with respect to Gaza, but more broadly across the region because of how cataclysmically these events unfolded in the past week.
Professor Stein, last word to you.
You know, it's interesting because we were just talking about Tony Blinken being in the Middle East. He's there for two reasons. For the reasons that Marissa just mentioned, to send a strong message, don't escalate. But he's also there, despite the really quite extraordinary speeches he has given in response to these horrific photos that he's seen, he's also there to slow down any decision by Israel on a ground offensive. That is not the first time the U.S. has done this. It generally works. You don't start something like that when the U.S. Secretary of State is in the region. They are buying time now for the hostage negotiations in the hope that they can avoid a massive ground offensive. So I don't think the decision has been made yet.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. I appreciate the discussion very much and all of your insight and analysis tonight. Janice Stein, Marissa Kerma, and Dave Perry. Coming up next, we're live in Tel Aviv. Adrian Gobriel is with us. He spent a lot of the day at the airport where Canadians were waiting for those evacuation flights. He'll tell us how that went down in just a few moments. Stay right there. More Power Play ahead.